Hello and welcome to another episode of the Rippling Pages podcast with me, Liam Bishop, a writer from Leeds, but we're far away from the grey skies of the north of England this week. This week we're in San Andrés, a beautiful island in the Caribbean Sea, blue skies and seas with sandy beaches and palm trees. Yet for Victoria, the protagonist of Cristina Bendek's Salt Crystals, she's returning to the island where her family have lived for generations, and beneath the surface, there's more than meets the eye as Victoria explores her personal history and a family trauma, and the island's complicated legacy too. Originally written in 2018, Salt Crystals has won literary awards in Colombia, and since then, it's been translated into Portuguese and is now being translated into English by Robin Myers for Charco Press. Having translated writers such as Andrés Newman and Isabel Zapata, Robin is a writer too, with poems published in Poetry London and the Yale Review, among others. Cristina joined me from Berlin and Robin from Mexico City.
I want to start by just talking about the very first words of this novel. The first words are, and the first line is, "I'm from this island in the Caribbean." Now, this is such a fantastic line because it feeds into the kind of conflicting history of your protagonist, Victoria, and the ideas about the island itself. Can you give us some insight into San Andrés and why it's the setting of this novel?
I remember very clearly deciding that this would be the first words in the novel, that this would be the starting point, because it is a novel about identity. So in a way, starting this way is a way of locating the reader and of locating the narrator within the whole island setting right since the beginning. And it's already a way of letting everyone know that this is going to be a story in which identity and the place where you were born take special meaning. Besides, there are so many things that get very complicated when you state that you're from this Caribbean island, San Andrés. And the reason why this was very important for me is because it's always been a very powerful source of doubt, basically, being from San Andrés. What does this mean? San Andrés is a very rich, it's a very small, it's a 27 square kilometer island right in the middle of the southwestern Caribbean area between Colombia but actually closer to the Central American coastline and limiting with many different states, actually 6 different international borders right there. And it's a place that has inherited many different colonialisms. And when you say you're from San Andrés, this is something that's not actually, it could mean anything. If you don't know what the person looks like, for example, or what the origins of the person are, or where this person's family comes from, this could mean anything. This could mean you're from Arabic origins, for example, or it could mean you're from African descent, heritage, or it could mean that you have Irish or Scottish or English blood running through your veins, or that you come from the continental Colombian mainland.
Something that we give in such common parlance every day. We identify ourselves by where we're from, in inverted commas. But from there on in, the whole novel feels like an exploration of what this line means or doesn't mean. How difficult is it to write about a character reconciling with some of the more darker aspects of the place she was from? And how difficult is it to sort of write about reconciling with these ideas?
I would say it's terribly difficult. Once you make peace with these conflicting aspects of the place, of myself being from this place, and of course this being the reason why I'm so obsessed about it, and I will continue to be obsessed about it, the only thing that you can do is enjoy a little bit of this momentaneous peace, knowing that it will be momentaneous. And actually everything in this island, it has come to be my impression, is momentaneous. Everything seems to come and go, and you just seem to be at the position to just grab things and just catch things the way that you can and just absorb them and enjoy them and live through them just as long as they last. Everything seems to be a bit ephemeral. There are so many tensions between what is political, what is cultural, and what is spiritual about identity within this novel, and within myself, of course, and embodied in the character of Victoria. That once you play with the title and with this trope that I thought of, the salt crystals. Once you crystallize a certain notion about identity and this condensates finally, the only thing that you can do again, just enjoy the moment, because it will not last. And this is what happens with this Caribbean identity from San Andrés. You cannot really understand, you cannot really detach, for example, the African descent aspect from the continental aspect, from the colonial heritages that we have, from the Arabic influences that we also already own, and all of these optics that are all of these lenses that we are already using to understand ourselves, and the racial identities of the indigenous community from the islands. When you condense all of these, the only thing that you can do is just enjoy the little space of peace in which all of these identities can coexist.
I absolutely love that word, momentaneous. It's such a fantastic word to describe a novel. Novels, we think of these fixed things, these physical things that sort of endure history and time. But to write something momentaneous that is sort of more transient and fluid, it's such an interesting idea. Robin, don't know if you've ever visited San Andrés. How did this come alive on the page? Did it come through the translation? How were you approaching it when you sort of first read it in Spanish?
There are two things that come to mind most in listening to your question. And one is, the first part, I have not been to San Andrés, which is always a disconcerting experience as a translator. I live in Mexico City. I've translated a lot of Mexican writers, and I would say also just in terms of sheer number of Argentine writers as well. And I have spent some time in Argentina, and I've been to mainland Colombia, to Medellin and Bogota, and I have some Colombian friends, and so I have, on some level, a sort of there is some kind of Colombian Spanish in my ear, but certainly less so than the kind of Spanish that I have learned most intimately and that I live around most intimately. And I don't have a visual image of having, or a physical experience of being San Andrés. And so when that happens, which I think is not an insurmountable obstacle, but it certainly makes for a different point of entry into a translation, and it makes for a very different kind of homework, I'd say. And so, there's also something really inviting and immersive about Cristina's book, in that it offers up a lot of the history, both very recent and centuries of history of San Andrés. But I knew that I both needed and wanted to do a lot of other reading about the history of San Andrés, and so I found actually a lot of really excellent academic articles online, mostly in Spanish, much less in English, about the history of San Andrés, about different cultural backgrounds in San Andrés. And what was also just the most wonderful part of the process of translating this book was getting to talk with Cristina. And we had this very funny sort of routine where I would, I made many questions and notes to myself in the margins of my first draft of the translation. And Cristina, being the wonderful, warm, and patient person she is, received an enormous amount of these questions directly from me. And so I would WhatsApp her a series of, I think we sort of would do kind of 5 or 10 a day for a while. And then Cristina would respond. We would, trade voice notes also. And so there was, an enormous amount that I learned directly from her as the author, and her as someone who has such a rich firsthand knowledge of San Andrés culture. I went down various rabbit holes in the way that is inevitable and important, I think, in translating. I, listen to different kinds of music that come up in the translation. It just, to be able to just have more of a sensory range of everything that gets referenced and explored in the book felt important. And I knew that I needed to step it up as the translator. I needed to do, the kind of research that, I think I often thought of research as strictly sort of historical materials and historical dates. But a lot of the research that I think is so important in a translation is sort of the texture of a text, of speech and music and sounds. I also did, some research in sort of Google Earth and looking at the way that buildings are built, routes, just to get a sense of the geography, which is so intimately explored.
Do you take this approach to every novel?
I do some degree of this with every novel. And I think there are some novels that there are some novels that are less enmeshed in place, where there is this, and so there's, obviously every novel is set somewhere in some way, but I think the intensity and the detail of place, the importance of place, and also just the involvement with different kinds of historical moments and processes they are in a way characters too in this book. And so I think it did call for an especially intense kind of research. And I think also just recognizing that it was a place I knew less about firsthand. I felt that some of, Cristina talking about, the rootedness of identity in this book, the sense of being from and part of so many things, and cultural backgrounds and moments in time. I think there's something really special and expansive about the structure of this novel, and about how there are certain moments when Cristina talks about the momentaneous and the ephemeral. There are moments of the book where the narrative delves into a particular moment. And I think what felt important to me, beyond what we've just been talking about in terms of research and background and history, is to let those moments of total presentness, there are moments when she's swimming in the ocean, or when she's dancing, or when Victoria is having these moments of connection to the past and imagining her ancestors, where on the level of language, there is a kind of vividness and openness and expansiveness. It's like there's sort of this stream of consciousness in a way, that I felt that as a translator on the level of language, my job was to let that moment feel as vivid as possible. And so that's where sort of I come to translation from the translation of poetry and the writing of poetry, where the language takes the center stage.
And you did it so beautifully.
Thank you.
The novel has had a few translations to Danish and to Portuguese. In English, I had possibility to engage to what I'm reading in a more intimate way than I can in either of those other languages. And it was, for me, it's just such a special experience to read your work. Actually, it feels as if I can take a very, very productive and inspiring and insightful creative perspective on the novel that supposedly I wrote myself. It's as if I was revisiting the whole experience from a completely different tone, from a completely different place. I've talked about this sensation before. And I will continue to explore this myself while engaging with your translation, because it makes me feel something very, very special, and I'm just really, really happy with what happens to me when I read your words and your choices.
Robin, you called this book in a translator's notes an intrinsically multilingual book. Great phrase. I love that phrase. And you called it a challenge and a thrill to translate. Do you think the linguistic challenge, and I guess for you, Cristina, as well, are the linguistic challenges intrinsic to some of the challenges that the narrator endures in exploring the island and her family's history?
Absolutely. I mean, I think among all the other threads of identity that are followed and explored and interwoven throughout the book, there is also this exciting and complicated entanglement of language, of a narrator who is a Spanish speaker, who is of Raizal ancestry, but who does not speak Creole, and that is part of her own struggle and sense of self sort of revision and returning to San Andrés and learning more about her own background and getting to know young people who are intensely involved politically in the daily life and present and past and future of San Andrés, where Creole is an important part of their own identity that she both shares and feels excluded from and feels ashamed of. Languages have different political roles, that it's not a question of, okay, here's an English word in the text, I'm going to switch it for Spanish. It's not a one-to-one correspondence. It calls for a constant evaluation and self self-interrogation about what different languages are doing politically and socially. And so it felt also important. It felt important to let that happen in Spanish, in the translation, in my English translation. It felt important also to not over-explain, to sort of think very carefully about when it was important to contextualize a little bit more or a little bit differently than what happens in Spanish. And at the same time, to remember that this is a novel that is in the first person, that has a kind of diaristic quality in some ways, that there are passages in the book where Victoria is explicitly writing to herself. And then also that, it would feel very weird for there to be a sort of parenthetical statement inserted in the novel. So I think, there were lots of considerations that I made, lots of things that Cristina and I talked about together about how to allow the narrative in English to be fluid, to be as fluid as possible, and to incorporate these different languages in a way that also reflects moments of strangeness and of not complete knowing that the narrator herself experiences and that other people in the book experience, and that the linguistic experience of Victoria is not being completely sure of what everything means all the time. And so why should an English language reader have that experience too?
Just listening to you right now, putting it in words, of course, because we did it, and I was just thinking, my God, I don't even remember everything that we did and all of the choices that you had to make going through the challenge of doing this. And I think that that's just pure art, actually, to just finding the way to synchronize everything, just so that you play with these curiosities. And for me, for example, I just wanted to note, I had to make certain choices that I wasn't fully sure if I could make them, not being a Creole native speaker myself. What I did was a bit like in the novel, what I decided to do with Creole language was writing it in the way that I listened to it and in the way that I've always heard it around myself, growing up and just being in the island, which is I think for islanders from these islands, if we are abroad and far from Creole native speakers for too long, we already start missing the way that this sounds and what it does, what the sound of what a certain pronunciation does when it hits you. And I decided to use this very personal experience just to say that there are also other written forms of Creole. So what I did, since there is still not a clear consensus about the way that it should be written, about a grammar in particular for this Creole, I just wrote it in the way that it sounds. So it's a phonetic transliteration instead of using even the rules of English. And I've heard already English native speakers, readers, engaging with reading out loud. And this experience of reading out loud also is something that I found very particular, like leading a reader to also pronounce a form of language that is not, that you don't think you can acknowledge just right away. But then when you use the spoken word, it comes clear and you already acknowledge the words that you're reading. And I think it's just very magical, because the Caribbean is, of course, a very, we are used more to oraliture, to our oral literatures, than to the written forms of literature. So, and it's a way of keeping the language alive also, and of also going across borders, which I think is something really magical. And again, that Robin helps us achieve.
For me, there's this dynamic between sort of conscientization of Victoria. The more she sort of finds out, the deeper she sort of gets, and the bigger the web gets of interconnected histories and traumatic histories and colonial histories. Which came first, the kind of exploration of the history of Victoria's family, or the kind of more recent tragedy of Victoria?
I wanted her to be lonely subject, because I didn't want her to have access to these filtered family memories. I just wanted her to have a very raw version of her own family, and then just coming from that, just getting into the island and trying to find the truth. I think in my own experience, in my whole life experience is about going back to San Andrés. This is what I will do my whole life. Yes, I will always go back to San Andrés, and I will always, I will never stop discovering it. It's just such an amazingly complex place. I could really spend the rest of my life trying to understand it. And every time that I come back, my own gaze is affected by this re-encounter. And again, I am seeing things that I couldn't have seen for me. Histories are painful, and histories do things to families. And sometimes families are not really aware of how much, and we as subjects are not really aware of how affected we are by our contexts in the way that we make choices. So sometimes some of these choices we conceal from the next generation, or we kind of rephrase or reframe for the next generation in order to hide certain pain, to avoid certain pain. But we can't actually change our attitudes or our personalities or our persona. We cannot really change the way that we relate to the next generations overall. We can choose silence, but the pain is still going to be there, and our mechanisms of defense are always going to be there. So this is also the reason why I chose that this character would be alone, because she wouldn't have to fight her family's own lies. Also, I wanted her to discover something about her own symptoms and her own embodiment of pain and of historical trauma, which is her diabetes. This is a way, for me, it was a way of thinking, okay, this is a character who has a disease, and this is an island who is also a character who also has a disease. And I'm gonna do something with these two bodies, and I'm gonna set certain correspondences between these two bodies and see what historical trauma has done to the whole community and to the island, and to, because it creates relationships in the way that we relate to the environment. It's the way that we relate to history in itself, and what we've learned from history affects the way that we relate to the environment and to the collectivity. I wanted to see what family trauma did to her own personal body, and see if there was a way that she could shed light in these correspondences. So this was a choice, that she would be alone and that she would have the disease of the Caribbean, which is diabetes, which is so entangled with, of course, the sugar plantation, the sugarcane plantation.
So you chose then diabetes as a kind of psychosomatic, physical embodiment of this relationship with history.
Yes, because I wanted us to reflect upon the fact that these are not metaphors. These things about our colonial past, we live them, we are affected by them in our bodies. Racism is a way of doing that, of course, of being affected from this colonial past and from these colonial devices and from these colonial oppressions. But there are other ways, of course, and this pain and disease is another way of being affected. And I think, again, the less we come to realize about this problematic past, and the less that we can put it out in words, and the less narratives that we can actually thread about it, and just bring it out and do this kind of exorcism and actually name things by the way that they were. Yes, we had slaves, we were these people, or yes, we don't know our past because our people came here abducted, or we have inherited certain privileges, or we have inherited certain painful conditions. And if we don't have these conversations in such a small island, we are going to forever bear the costs of these without being able to solve the real root of this. And it gets even more complicated because this is an island with very, very recent mass immigration. And these recent immigrants from the continental mainland don't really have a way to sail through these complexities. In many ways, they are just not aware, especially if they are the kind of immigrant who looks for a way to profit from mass tourism and has the means to do so, so just establishes in a certain layer of society. It's just completely ignorant of the underlying conditions of the society that he's coming in to settle. And this just complicates things even more. And it complicates competition over the land even more, and resources. And then again, all the environmental aspects of the novel then come to place.
Now, we know the Rippling Pages is all about supporting writers from presses, big, small, all different kinds of presses. I just love great fiction. One way to help support that process is by leaving a small review on your favourite podcast provider, because what this does is boost the visibility of the episode, like this one with Cristina and Robin, and all the other episodes with the great writers we've had on the Rippling Pages. So if you do have time to leave a review, I'd obviously be massively, massively grateful. Otherwise, no problem at all. It's just great to have you here. And please do enjoy the rest of the episode.
Obviously, we can't change history, and you spoke a lot about the kind of discovery of history for Victoria and what she goes through to discover the history. Can this understanding change? Can this perception change? Or does the knowledge of it change the person?
It was really fascinating for me to translate this book, thinking about my own background and my own location. I'm from the United States. I grew up there. I live in Mexico City, which, so I come from a country that has colonized and economically exploited Mexico, for centuries, and does so to this day. And I'm also someone who, was born into a system of white privilege in the United States that has certainly benefited me, and that I have, like many people, have been reckoning with and asking myself hard questions about. But a branch of my family is Mexican, so I'm, a white American living in Mexico with Mexican background. And my Mexican family can trace itself back to a conquistador of the city of Monterrey. And so I know the name, of that man who contributed to the massacre of indigenous populations, and contributed to the Mexico is a country that most present day Mexicans descend both from, use the language of the conqueror, the conquerors and the conquered, the oppressors and the oppressed. And so I have a name that I can place to a particular person, and yet my family history is also shared by millions of contemporary Mexicans in one way or another, whether they know the names of those oppressive ancestors or do not. And so thinking about, contemporary and past colonization, thinking about translating this book into English, which is an imperial language, undeniably, as is Spanish, we could say. I don't know if, I think it feels to me, speaking for myself, illusory to say that simply by becoming aware of these dynamics, can they change? Can they change things on a systemic level? I think that there's a sort of, sounds like a tangent, but I read something recently which I thought was a beautiful description of what the value of poetry is, which I think can be applied to many other forms of art, which is I think it's Geoffrey Hill who said that poetry is a sad and angry consolation, which I've been thinking about. And I think that there is a sad and angry consolation at work in Salt Crystals, and that it is a place that Victoria comes to on a level, and that taking stock of all of these systems of power in which she is both a colonial subject, and so she is caught in it and tamped down by it, and she's also descends from people who have profited off of that, and is now tapped into a network of young people who are deeply committed to and invested in doing that sort of stock taking among themselves, in trying to address these historical grievances and injustices, and are committed to thinking together about how to resist and how to work towards a future that is more just for the land, for the planet, for each other. And yet that doesn't just happen, and these forces are so powerful, both historical forces and contemporary economic forces. And there is a sense of powerlessness, of frustration, of anger, and that doesn't, and also of self-criticism too, as Cristina has alluded to, sort of seeing where movements of resistance can betray themselves or can dilute themselves. All of that is part of this. And so I think, for me, thinking about this novel and thinking about the ways that it's also helped me think about some of these dynamics in my own multiple sort of concentric environments, I think that sort of awareness is profoundly important because it does change an individual. It does change, it keeps you uncomfortable, which I think is essential. I mean, any time in thinking about these, you get super comfortable, just, oh, great, figured that out. Now I'm off the hook forever. That's not the goal here. The goal is to keep asking these questions and to keep asking them with other people, because I think that there's something about the solitary exercise, which is important, but then it stays within you. And I think the sense of community is something that can be very small and that is involved in reckonings that can happen in groups of people, in friends, in families, in small organizations. That feels essential, and that is that the sort of change that can happen there is nothing to sneeze at, and yet the sort of the landscape beyond that is the sad and angry consolation is sometimes, I think, all of it feels accessible, which is a hard note to end on, and it's also true, I think.
It's not enough to be aware that actually in the way that you are living in this oceanic island, this way in itself of reproducing modernity is a way of reproducing colonialism, of course. But I think at the moment that you become aware and are disturbed by this idea and start actually what Robin just said, taking it into collective spaces, then you create not even these massive movements or these big political endeavors, but you create certain less pretentious and you get involved into less pretentious actions that in the end mean a lot more, because they just go on transforming the way that we perform ourselves every day. For example, if we in an island like this, I located from there because it's just easier to think that you can change something in such a small place. It's easier to think that we can change something in, for example, larger cities or larger communities. If we think where our food comes from, for example, and we start realizing that we need to take back on our own food, and we start growing the land, and we start giving the land back its central role and that it used to have, and that it has actually in our racial culture in the islands, then we're doing something, right? So if we first become aware of what these colonial systems have done to us, and actually bringing us up under the illusion that we can continue to live under certain conditions and within certain circumstances, and that this could go on forever. And if we wake up from these, and if we create communities that feel the same way, then we can, and it's not even something that you can ask for permission, or that you need to ask permission about. It's not something that you have to negotiate with the state. It's not something, because sometimes we think that there needs to be a larger pact for us to start doing these things, I guess. And this is something very, very hard to do, but it sounds really simple, but it's very hard to execute and to live accordingly. These small changes can really mean a lot more when they are shared within a community. So I think people in San Andrés are starting already to do this, and Providence, but yet again, I think the awareness of how affected we've all been by this homogenized idea of how existence needs to be, and how we need to, what we need to achieve, and how we need to project ourselves. If this thing, project yourself or whatever, leave the island. Actually, this was the way that most of us were raised. This is a place where you need to escape from. And actually, many of us have been raised in this way.
Sometimes it felt like resistance was a good word, in a positive word. It was a tool that she needed. But sometimes we talk about personal resistances to acknowledging our parts in histories. And that's why I found resistance such an interesting word. And she's checking in her blood sugar levels all the time. She's and she has to make sure her diet is regulated. And it was a kind of only instance really in this book of an equilibrium, a regulation, something that kind of brought us back to a kind of stasis and stability by Victoria checking into her blood sugars and her diet and making sure that it becomes a refrain really. And it's the kind of moment where we sort of get brought back to Victoria and her experience and her.
It's just too hard sometimes to bear into account all the possibilities around a certain problem that we may be facing. But disease is a very emotional thing. In the book, it is diabetes that leads her to Ma Josephine, which is this character that embodies memory and this sort of a motherly figure for her, a grandmother, the grandmother she didn't have, that is this woman that has this sort of bank of memory for the island. And that also gives her a sort of psychedelic device for her to explore on her own and to encounter paths of towards her own histories, and not just, of course, her own history or mine, which is the one that I was trying to explore, but the histories of the island. This is something I guess it's important. This is my great grandparents. In the picture that Victoria finds, I found this picture, and I wanted to know who they were, where they came from, how they made it into this island. One was of Scottish descent, the other was of Irish descent, and I wanted to know. It was just such a particular image when I found it that I wanted to know. I thought it was just full of secrets, and no one in my family really knew much about their parents or where they came from or what they did and so on. And then it was actually the island herself that started giving me hints on all of these. And it's not, again, just my particular personal story, but it's also a way, and I would want people to also take this, readers, if anything, it's just the fact that no personal history is really personal at all. It is just traversed and just pierced by so many histories, and so not just from people around you, but we are such a collective product. We're not alone.
What was the quote, Robin, from Geoffrey Hill? Sad and angry.
A sad and angry consolation.
Well, I was going to say, this novel for me reminds me of a constellation, and like a consolation for some, I'm sure. And it joins that. Well, I'm not going to use the word tradition, but it joins this relatively modern form of the novel that I think that Olga Tokarczuk has spoken a bit about when she won the Nobel Prizes. She called it a constellation novel, and it's about all these different interconnecting influences that aren't always apparent, that aren't always clear. And that for me was what the novel became. It was this, if you want to call it, a hybrid between sort of fiction and non-fiction, the kind of delivery of its tone and some of the facts, but obviously a fictional protagonist, but all these kind of different forms and bodies that were interacting when we weren't always clear what the interaction of those were all the time. Or some people were clear of what the interaction were, but then, anyway. But for me, that's what this reminded me of, a constellation and a consolation.
and sad, a sad and angry one sounds actually sounds actually really nice.
I think one thing I really love about the novel too is how much of it involves people talking to each other. I think so much of the resistances that we've been talking about, and there's this phenomenon that we experience several times in the novel, which I think is so beautiful. It's the idea of, the phrase is a thinking rundown, and a group of people getting together to sort of huddle and talk really, really hard together, to think out loud together about history and about the present and about what happened historically that could have been otherwise, what is happening now that could be otherwise, and then eating dinner and drinking beer and enjoy and having a party, and I think the idea also that there is something really joyful and alive and enlivening about this sort of conversation that can be hard and painful and exposing to the people who are part of it, and yet is also part of this sort of celebratory act, which I think is something that we can see in protests all over the world. I'm thinking about, the women's marches in Mexico City, about, I don't know, protests everywhere. I think there are often these moments of explosive, sort of riotous love, and wonder. And so I think, something I would love readers to take away from this book is also just this sense of marveling at what can happen when people get together to talk to each other in a really honest way, and how they can accompany each other doing that.
That is so beautiful.
Yeah, such a oral novel in the sense, it's called salt, and it immediately evokes the idea of sort of taste and salt, but then there's obviously the diet of the diabetes, and there's loads of dialects and loads of just characters discussing ideas. Such a modern, innovative novel in a way, I thought, but also kind of rooted in just about characters interacting. Thank you guys for joining me from different parts of the globe. It is one of the pleasures of, I think, one of the unexpected pleasures of being able to sort of do a podcast like this, and we can sort of reach across different countries and different time zones.
I just want to say thank you so much for having me, for having us. I've enjoyed this conversation a lot, and I enjoyed it just too much. And thank you, Liam, for such generous words, and for such for receiving the novel in such a broad way and having it. Yes, thank you very much, and thank you, Robin. It's been a pleasure to hear your insights and your ideas.
I would like to say the same. Thank you so much, Liam, for such a committed and thorough and curious reading of this work. And thank you, Cristina, always for your generosity and brilliance. And it's just such a pleasure to speak to both of you, and such a joy to have gotten to work with you on this amazing book.
Thanks very much to Cristina and Robin for joining me for today's episode. And of course, my biggest thanks is reserved to you. Listeners are what makes the podcast and keeps the podcast going. Now, that does bring us to the end of Series 3, Beneath the Surface. But there is going to be one more episode before the end of the year, and that's a special bonus episode. Now, if you'd like to find out what that is, you're going to have to follow the Rippling Pages on social media. That's Rippling_pages. That's at Rippling_pages. And that's for both Twitter and Instagram. Indeed, get in touch. Tell me what you enjoyed. Tell me what you might like to see on the Rippling Pages. I do enjoy hearing. Otherwise, it's until next time. Thanks very much.